Good morrow, fellow humans. My name is Sean, and I am obsessed with infinity. So join me as I attempt to unpick the infinities of what is. Whilst neuroscience may be considered amongst the most cutting edge of scientific fields, the debate as to whether the mind is solely of the body or whether it may persist in some way beyond physicality has endured both undeterred and unresolved for almost as long as we have shared ideas. And so, as you and I have been seeking out the ground floor to this physical self, I have of course heard the raging in the wings, where, like a children's pantomime, voices excitedly chant, "He's behind you, he's behind you," has my own personal cacophony been, "The brain, he's inside the brain." So let's do it. Let's dive into the heady mess of synapses and neurons and see if our answers don't come any easier here. In the ancient world, it was common for thinkers to draw a sharp divide between mind and body. For the Egyptians, this self, mind, or soul was actually broken into several parts. Ka was that which stayed behind after one's death, watching over the resting place of the corporeal body, whilst Ba, a human-headed bird-like spirit, passed freely between our world and the next. And for those who transcended this world, Akh was the part of oneself that could walk amongst the gods. For the Chinese Taoist, it is a duality of sensibility and spirit that is said to disband upon death, with the lower soul falling away whilst the Hun continues to live on, holding as the object of our ancestral worship. In Hinduism, the sensorial self is called the Atman. This is the soul who remains tied to the wheel of samsara, cycling through endless death and rebirth until a state of karmic perfection is attained, allowing for the individual to be united with the unmanifest and immutable that is Brahman. Though a significant quota of these ancient theologies have survived to the current day, it is perhaps the now lost theories of the ancient Greeks that were to have the greatest influence over our modern theological landscape. As a metropolitan melting pot, Greece didn't actually have an official, organised religion as we would recognise today. There was, of course, the more familiar polytheistic world of gods and goddesses, each responsible for the many aspects of daily life, but beyond this were many various sects and cults. For those seeking enlightenment, outsider religions, less spoken about in respectable company, could be found hosting late-night rituals beyond city walls. These so-called mysteries were open to all people, regardless of gender, status or creed. A place where men, women, slaves and enslavers could each seek out the riddles of reality, more often whilst under the influence of various psychedelics. The first rule of Mystery Club: don't talk about Mystery Club, which is why there's little known about them today. But even with this being the case, it was these very same mystery religions that were to influence an individual whose contributions to philosophy would go on to shape much of what we know today as Christianity and Islam. Plato and his Allegory of the Cave give us our fundamental argument concerning this mind-body dilemma. In it, he describes human experience as analogous to a man sitting beside a fire within the depths of a cave, forced to forever watch the play of light and dark shadows as they dance upon his cave wall. Because for the man, this is reality. And though the cave opening might always be there, just out of sight, he never thinks to turn around because he, like us all, is bound to his interpretation, thus never considering the possibility that such a wondrous outside world might exist. Like many in the ancient world, Plato also argued for the immaterial nature of the soul, countering the arguments offered by his contemporaries, the Pythagoreans, who, though they may not have denied the existence of a soul, did nonetheless see it as being tied to the physical body, making them perhaps our best counterpart to today's collective of material nihilists. In his text, The Last Days of Socrates, Plato confronts this opposition to an eternal soul in a scene where the friends of Socrates are found seeking comfort from their beloved friend and mentor in the face of his imminent execution. In the text, the Pythagoreans liken the soul to the attunement of an instrument, where once the instrument has been destroyed, it can no longer attain the ability to support its ephemeral harmony. Though the metaphor may be poetic, it's still very likely that such thinking would sit quite well with any neurobiologist of today who sees the nature of consciousness as little more than an emergent property of the brain. The familiar protagonist of Plato's work, Socrates, responds to his friend's fears by focusing on what he considers to be the nature of the soul. He reasons that if the soul were a form of attunement emerging from the instrument, then the instrument's tendency towards either harmony or dissonance would equate to a harmony or dissonance of the soul. However, for Socrates, no soul can ever be considered less or more harmonious. The instrument may suffer states of dissonance, but the soul is that which is harmonious by its very nature. For Plato, this soul-defining harmony is not the product of the instrument, but something perhaps more akin to the natural ratios of intervals and harmony that exist as an intrinsic aspect of nature. A musicality of nature that exists due to little more than a natural symmetry of waves in the environment. A harmony so familiar to modern science that it is considered no less than fundamental to reality itself. For Socrates and Plato, the instrument is tuned to access this harmony, not create it. Similar to how a baby is born with particular abilities and skills that find their root in a history that precedes the infant, the attunement likewise precedes the instrument's existence. The harmony is of nature and balance, not of physical creation. For Plato, it just seems obvious that the soul should lead the body rather than the other way around, and it is for this reason that the body is considered mortal, whereas the soul is eternal, a mind beyond the body. Much is subtle in these ancient texts, and so much more can be gained from repeated readings. Still, even with that being the case, it wouldn't be for another 2 millennia before a rigid distinction between the mental and material would be categorically defined. This duality is often attributed to Descartes and his interpretation of the res cogitans, the cognitive, and the res extensa, the material. But even in the 17th century, not all saw the divide as definite. While still undoubtedly religious, Descartes' contemporary Spinoza saw mind and body not as separate parts of nature, but as unique reflections of a singular, unified infinite, where all aspects of nature could be considered both in and of a oneness that is God. A oneness that doesn't hold in any high praise either harmony or instrument, since both are of the sole source. In saying this, Spinoza gives support to Plato's allegory of the cave by highlighting the problems that arise when we conflate experience with reality. But at the same time, does he deny Plato's argument for a soul more harmonious than the body, stating that, quote, "There are philosophers who have convinced themselves that the motions of the heavens give rise to harmony. All this goes to show that everyone's judgment is a function of the disposition of his brain, or rather that he mistakes for reality the way his brain is affected." The instrument and music are not separate, but neither are harmony and dissonance. Any such division is only a perspective of humanity. However, in recent times, evidence has begun to emerge suggesting that these ideologies are shifting. tending away from the dualities of old toward a more naturalist ideal of material-centred monism. Unlike Spinoza's spiritual monism, this modern monistic world is one of matter and nothing more. The once universally held belief that the mind or soul is separate from all that is physical is now becoming increasingly unfavourable with much of the younger demographic of the emerging world, who instead encourage the idea that this experience of self is simply an emergent phenomenon caused by purely functional, biological and electrical processes happening within the brain. Though the data is still relatively in its infancy, the ISSP survey on religion, carried out across 41 countries in 1991, 98, 08 and 2018, show an average global decrease in the number of people who believe in a God and, therefore, in an immaterial soul. Seen most dramatically within first world countries, concepts such as a higher self, now seemingly hard up against the evidence, are partly giving way to an atheist's faith in science, a shift that has been significantly influenced by the wider acceptance of scientifically advanced technologies, fueled by its ever-increasing powers of accessibility. A parallel change in global fertility rates does show that this trend of atheism will inevitably be undone as the more developed nations reduce their average number of children per family. However, the likelihood of this trend returning on a more global scale, once the unstoppable arm of communication reaches the extended world, does seem reasonable. Though as these technologies continue to rule our daily lives in these ever-increasing measures, it seems that our once culturally inspired ideas of self begin to require reinterpretation. But what exactly is this modern interpretation proposing? Bluntly, it suggests that the subjective self is emergent in the mind, whereas the mind itself is fundamentally physical. So what, if any, are the problems with this interpretation? Well, firstly, as we have found across the last 2 chapters, there is a lack of fundamental ground to this physicality, which can make it difficult for some to centre one phenomenon upon the other. And secondly, there still remains a vast chasm between our 2 worlds of mind and matter that is yet far from bridged. That said, among those seeking answers, it has far and away been those studying neuroscience that have attained the highest degree of success in terms of new insights. Our understanding of the mind and its behaviours, and, more acutely, the correlations between experience and neuronal activity, has been just as exponential as any other arm of the technological revolution. However, it must still be said that in no way have these successes eradicated the need for an independent, conscious driver. Instead, consciousness has retained a staunch defiance in the face of mechanical understanding, another in our shorelines of knowledge. However, for some, these obstacles are not considered insurmountable. Neuroscientists, the likes of Seth, often claim that it's not a matter of if, but when we shall understand consciousness using these methods. According to Seth and other advocates, a mechanistic understanding is all that will be needed to unlock the nature of consciousness. But if this is true, does it then mean, as Nietzsche's madman put it, that God is dead and we have killed him? Because as this picture comes into focus, we should ask, what is it that we are left with? What is it that we gain from this materialistic philosophy and its hows concerning the brain? And what does it tell us about the self and the world we live in? Housed within 400 miles of fatty capillaries, this miraculous electrical network consisting of 86 billion neurons, interlaced by another 100 trillion synapses, a figure greater than the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, collectively provide a count of connections higher than the number of atoms found in the entire observable universe. It is, without question, the single most complex thing ever known. But the most amazing thing about this 3-pound blubber of cells is not the number of ones and zeros that it can burn through, but that it is the place where every conscious experience takes place. Regardless of whether we take on the physicalist view or consider the perspective of an immaterial soul, the brain is still the place where the crosstalk of mind and matter takes place. So, for the sake of our ongoing investigation, let us for now agree and say that yes, it is here in the brain where every experience ever had, every sight, sound, touch or imagining takes place. So what would this mean? Well, what it means is that no experience you have ever had, be it the sight of your mother's face, the touch of your love, or even just the taste of your breakfast, none of it ever happened anywhere other than in the subjectivity of your experience. Because when materialism is taken seriously, none of these things we experience can really be said to have happened, at least not in the way we experience them. Because outside of the lightning storm of the brain, there is no way of knowing what forms or structures exist behind the limited translation of experience. As we have already discussed, outside of the brain, red is not red, blue is not blue, light is not bright, heat is not warm, and sound is not loud, for these are only the attributes of a conscious observer. The reality beyond interpretation is simply not one we have access to. Instead, it is the brain that receives the input from the countless vibrations of its environment, and it is the brain that converts this into our experience of waking life. 200 synapses fire every second, with each of these connected up to another 1,000 neurons, culminating in a set of actions that add up to more than 17 trillion different mental actions each and every second. Hundreds of billions of informational bits. But of this, we are only ever consciously aware of an approximate 2,000. And so it seems that the brain's power is more than just one's tool for navigating the world, since what it has been tasked with is something far more great, though less resource intensive. The activity of the brain is nothing less than the creation of your world and your experience of you in it. This explains why the vividness of dreams and hallucinations can be so inexorably real, since these altered states of consciousness are essentially the same phenomenon that causes our ordinary waking life. The only difference is the stream of vibrational input that influences each experience. But regardless of the method of input, we all know that the brain doesn't always get things right. All of us have, at one point in our lives, experienced some altered state or even a simple optical illusion where we have been fooled into seeing or hearing something that isn't there. For example, Magenta. It doesn't exist, though we are all quite happy to believe it does. Now clearly, all colour is only a manifestation of the mind. That we have established. What came first, as we said. But what we do know about colour, beyond the experience of it, is that it is induced by our brains when translating the wave properties of photons. But what's odd about magenta is that it doesn't even have a corresponding wavelength. Our brains invent the colour. This is due to how our eyes have evolved to translate those wave properties, those frequencies that fall within the visible light spectrum. Human vision requires 3 cones to see our colour palette, with each cone tuned to respond to either red, green or blue. Any wavelength within this RGB range is averaged out between the 1 or 2 rods that it falls closest to. For example, halfway between red and green is yellow, and halfway between blue and green is cyan. But when something has that even blend of red and blue, being at either ends of the spectrum, the middle average point is green. So why do we see magenta? Well, we have a dedicated green rod, so our brains know what green is, and this just isn't it. So instead it sums the difference between blue and red mentally, inventing what we call magenta. An even more drastic example is synesthesia, a sensorial disorder that occurs when sensory pathways are crossed within the brain. Though not yet fully understood, it can result in a wide variety of hallucinations activated in the brain when receiving input from separate and apparently non-related senses, like seeing taste or hearing colour. Synesthetes can even see emotionally charged colours emerge from emotionally written text, so words of hate can appear red or calm can appear blue. Movements of shapes and colours can even be seen floating before the eyes whilst listening to music. And so, as we all know, the senses can be fooled, because the world we experience is only a world of interpretation. What science has come to realise is that our world is fundamentally made of physical vibrations, a wealth of harmonic symmetries spilt atop a cornucopia of mediums from molecules to potentialities. Though its experienced qualities are not necessarily of this same physicality. The quality of brightness, colour, or noise are categorically not of the physical world because they do not belong to any description of the universe outside of consciousness. Instead, they seem to manifest purely within the mind and are emergent via this self in its capacity as consciousness. And so as we pursue our search for the self in the physical, regardless of what we may yet learn about the brain and its relation to mind, it seems that we have inadvertently learnt something unexpected about what this physicality is, i.e., something other than the world known by experience, suggesting that the real problem with the dualities of old may not be their untestable and highly conflated knowledge about a world that exists beyond our mortal experience, but the presumption that the world of our experience is itself equal with reality. This is the very point of Plato's Allegory of the cave. The fact is, we don't need to declare any knowledge about the world beyond our senses to know that the senses give us distortions of reality. To conflate the harmony found in experience, such as the beauty or ugliness of lights, sounds, or textures, with what reality is to take our perspective as ultimate. As Spinoza tells us, philosophers have driven themselves mad in presuming that God prefers order and harmony. And so, though we might ask, what does the universe look, sound, or even feel like outside of this conscious interpretation, we must eventually realise that because perspective is relative, these questions are meaningless. Just as in the case of classical Einsteinian relativity, where one cannot claim that any movement in space or time is an ultimate reflection of universal truth, neither can we claim any conscious perspective to be universal. Simply put, whenever we choose to look or listen to something, we are ourselves participating in the creation of that perspective. We are the frame from which that relative perspective can exist. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Because we are still left to ask, if the vessel that conjures the self cannot even stand up to the simplest of interrogations, how can we ever trust any understanding of the self, physical or otherwise? For it is here, within the brain's pantomime of the mind that we create, nurture, and come to terms with our concept of self and I. Forged in the stories attained throughout our lives, we each hold on to and arrest the many concepts, events, and opinions that we take as synonymous with the self. Stories that we integrate and, in turn, reinforce as we learn who we are, as we learn where we came from, where we belong, who we were, and who we have the ability to become. But as anyone who has experienced altered states can tell you, our attachment to these stories, these ideas of self, are far more fluid than what many of us would ever care to acknowledge. What we identify as the self is always wholly at the mercy of the senses and the brain's ability to translate its input accurately. This failing, the self that we know could disappear, and we could wake up tomorrow as anyone. As discussed in earlier chapters, the reasons why we instinctively fight such ideas of functional predeterminism, like the block universe description of time, or in this case, a mind determined by the physical attributes of the brain, is due to the ownership we wish to hold over our identities. We do not like time dictating the cause and effect of our experience, as we do not like to think that we are merely biological robots reacting to the biases of our internal machinery. And yet, contrary to these long-held inner desires, the more naturalistic, physicalist concept of self continues to rise in popularity every day. And so in the next chapter, let us ask, what is it about the knowledge we have acquired from the scientific revolution that, for many, has disintegrated any stable hope for an eternal self? And even if it does turn out to be correct, that we are mere biological machines with only an illusion of self, would this be the end of the road? Or can this, as an idea, take us somewhere new? Good morrow, fellow humans. Lovely to have your company once more. I'd very much appreciate if you would all join us in the comment section, letting us know what you think. Let us know what your philosophical insights are, what your take is on the topic at hand, and if you have any insights that are relevant as far as the scientific literature that you would like to share, that would be appreciated too. Obviously, next will be further investigations into the physicality of the brain and how the brain works and where the self emerges, and we will start to talk about psychedelic research and all sorts of other kind of cool, wacky, interesting ideas. But I look forward to seeing you all then. Apart from that, good morrow, much love, and I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. All right, see you later. Bye.